Hi, Ian Bly, Optimize Results like a personal trainer for your mind. And tonight we're going to be talking about 5 very simple rules for extraordinary relationships. After decades of couples and team coaching, and as well as my own personal experience in relationships, I've found that the vast majority of the stuff we get tangled up in really boils down to some very simple shifts in behavior and attitude. I'm not saying simple is the same as easy, just that these are inherently obvious and straightforward actions, even if they tend to hide under multitudes of narratives and storylines. And we always have all kinds of background excuses for why we react the ways we do and are triggered by the things we're triggered by. A very important thing to remember is that our triggers are our responsibility, not everyone else's. Sort of gotten to be kind of a fad nowadays to blame everybody in the world for what bothers us, when it's really what bothers us needs to be dealt with. And I just wanted to put this out there before we get into the specific actions, because this is one of the most common reasons people bounce from relationship to relationship to relationship. They're looking for someone who won't trigger them, rather than solving their own issues with their triggers. Because if it's not one person triggering you, it's going to be another. If not at home, it'll be at work. If not at work, it'll be at home. We own our own triggers and our own buttons, and we take them with us wherever we go. And that includes relationship to relationship. So that said, let's look at these 5 simple rules and think in terms of each one supporting the next, so they share a common thread. Rule number 1. Over communicate versus under communicate. In my 3 strikes of communication talk, I address the dangers of assumptions and projections and explicit versus implicit communication. This is often an area creating needless conflict. So just to summarize quickly, assumptions and projections take the place of real and important information. They're placeholders. When we don't have information, we tend to fill in the blanks with assumptions that we make up in our own heads. And assumptions are about what the other person might mean, as opposed to taking their words at face value. And our assumptions are heavily rooted in how we think, not in how they think. This is, of course, a two-way street. So the other person is just as likely to be making assumptions about what we're saying rather than taking it at face value. Projections are pretty similar, but we're inserting our own experiences, responses, and reactions into the other person, which is also not hearing them. If we're leaving room for them to project, we need to pay attention so we can catch it early. That's under communicating. It's really just not being super clear and not being super explicit. Leaving room for assumptions and projections means we've under communicated. One of the common ways a perfectly innocent assumption shows up is in assuming that fully communicating will cause conflict or make trouble. Now, most of the time, that's a result of how we say what we say. So it'll be less of a problem if the remaining 4 rules are followed. They go in order for a reason. So for rule number 1, just keep in mind, when in doubt, straighten it out. Nobody should just know anything. And rule number 2, recognize our frameworks of understanding. Our frameworks of understanding are how we take in and sort information. And it's easy for us to think that we see things objectively. We see what others will see, we hear what others will hear, so on. That's really far from the case. Our frameworks are ours, and we must recognize this first. Our framework is how we attach meaning, and how we attach meaning is a result of our own lifetime of experiences. Nobody else has had your lifetime of experiences, so their framework is going to be very different. One of my favorite examples of a very different framework of understanding is the difference between the fish and the bird. And the bird will look down at the fish wondering why in the world they're underwater, and how can they just breathe The word just does come up a lot, like, why doesn't he just fly? Because that's such a natural part of the bird's framework. And the fish will look up at the bird wondering how they can breathe and move through the air instead of the water. And maybe why doesn't he just swim like me? It seems like the easiest natural thing to do for each of them. So if our framework is centered on safety and security, we're less likely to understand someone's actions whose framework is centered on approval or acceptance, or on being right or in control. In other words, living in a pond makes absolutely no sense to a bird. Rule number 3, the empty cup. There's a Zen story that I'll greatly abbreviate for you about a student who felt that he'd studied long and hard, and he wanted the master to give him the total meaning of life, Zen, and everything right there. The master said, well, let's have tea first. And he began to pour the student's cup. So there he is, pouring and pouring, and it starts overflowing, and the student shouts, stop, there's no room for more. And the master replied, yes, your cup is so full of opinions, speculations, and preconceptions, there's no room. Before you can learn, you must empty your cup. And this is what we need to do with our framework of understanding, as difficult as that might be. If I'm to understand the life of a fish, I first have to empty my cup of my bird framework. We need to let them write on our blank page. Which brings us to rule number 4. Answer every problem with compassion. So once we've emptied our cup of silly narratives like, I don't take insults from anybody, we can go deeper and we can ask ourselves, who does this serve? And how does it serve all? When the Buddha was stopped in the street by a man who angrily called him names, his response was loving kindness and compassion. He smiled and said something along the lines of, anger is like holding a hot coal to throw at someone. It really does more damage to the one holding it. Because long afterward, the man would still be suffering the anguish of his anger, while Buddha, unattached to this man's anger, would be on his way. Now, as a kid in New York, I was often a target of bullies. I found that when I had compassion for their unhappy states that led them to believe that beating me up would make them feel better, it was a kind of a pattern interrupt. So at first they were confused, which slowed them down long enough to have a conversation. I pointed out that it had never worked in the past. They were doing this all the time and they were still miserable. So maybe we could find another way. I was probably remembering the fable of Androcles removing the thorn from the lion's paw. That was a very worthy lesson, as it really, really worked. These bullies and I often became friends. And that brings us to rule number 5. Let go of the tug of war rope. We're saving the biggest problem for last. The number one cause of conflict in any relationship is always a power struggle. It's always about control. There's either a gardener and a garden, or each person keeps trying to top the other, back and forth, back and forth. And the latter causes constant conflict and is utterly irrelevant to a relationship or a team. I mean, think about it. You don't tackle your own quarterback. This means throwing away the silliness of childish posturing. Scorekeeping keeps us on opposite sides rather than on the same team. I did this for you, but you didn't do that for me is two separate people. I did this for us is a couple or a team. We're each responsible for being our best, not someone else's idea of best. And if you're in a loving relationship, not an abusive one, it means loving that person, not trying to change them. If change is needed for the good of the relationship, that's different. That's definitely a worthy conversation. If it's abuse, alcohol, something along those lines. But if it's to please someone, it's antithetical to authenticity, and that's not sustainable. And these 5 rules may seem overly simple, as I mentioned earlier, but they're not necessarily easy to implement. We need to be extremely conscious and aware of what we're saying and doing, and be able to hit the brakes far more often than the accelerator. Explicit communication and compassion, rather than posturing and narratives, is really the overall meta plan. So just to summarize, rule number one, over communicating is better than under communicating. How many Elizabethan, or I should say Victorian stories have you heard where, gosh, just say it, just tell them, if they would only say what's on their mind. Number two, recognize our own frameworks of understanding. A bird is going to have a very hard time understanding fish. Number three, empty our cup of all of that stuff, all of our preconceptions, all of the argument we had in our head before we ever started. Empty. Number four, answer every problem with compassion. Number five, let go of the tug of war rope. Because it's really simple. We just need to be our best selves in relationship, which just means be present, be kind, be real. Thank you.